Hello, and welcome to A Reader's History of Science Fiction. I'm Alex Howe, and this is Season 2, Episode 24. Catch-up Episode Number 9, Classics Lightning Round. So, this isn't exactly a catch-up episode like I've been doing. This is a catch-up episode to fill in some classic sci-fi books that I meant to cover in Season 1, but I didn't have a good place to fit them in. To be honest, it's not exactly a lightning round either. Early in Season 2, I thought I might have a lot of books to cover in this episode, but at the end of the day, there were only 4. Now, if we're talking about classics of sci-fi, I admit there are some books I maybe should have taken a closer look at, like Jack Vance's The Dying Earth, Gene Wolfe's The Book of the New Sun, Maureen F. McHugh's China Mountain Zhang, and so on. If you think I missed something important, well, those are the books that simply didn't come up when I made my first reading list. I didn't have Worlds Without End's aggregator list at the time, so it wasn't as comprehensive as I'd like. This is another area where I'll consider doing a special edition later on, but for now, let's take a look at these 4. Let's start with a new wave story, Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes. Flowers for Algernon is pretty core new wave in theme, but I didn't have an episode specifically about, what would I call this? Psychological sci-fi, maybe? I covered disasters, dystopias, and social issues, especially feminism. I think I'd call it in the same vein as feminist sci-fi, in the sense of being an early effort at addressing the issues of marginalized groups. Obviously a different group. In fact, Keyes was inspired to write the story based on his interactions with real special needs students after seeing them struggle to maintain their academic gains. So real-world issues were definitely at the forefront of his mind. Flowers for Algernon began as a short story in 1959, which was expanded into a novel in 1966. The main character, Charlie, is a mentally disabled man, although they used a different word back then, who undergoes an experimental surgery to increase his intelligence. Algernon is the lab mouse the surgery was tested on first. The surgery works, maybe even too well, as Charlie turns into a world-class genius, but he soon learns that it brings him a whole new host of problems. He begins to fully comprehend the troubling aspects of his past, how he was abused by his mother, mistreated by his co-workers, and is still viewed as a lab experiment by his doctors. And, after falling in love with his reading teacher, Miss Kinnian, he finds he hasn't been helped there either, as they're just as unable to relate to each other now as they were before. And then, to top it all off, he discovers that his gain in intelligence is temporary, and he begins falling back to his original circumstances. Actually, there was a minor issue I had with the story there. I remember feeling like the revelation that Algernon was losing his intelligence kind of came out of nowhere, or at least that it flew under Charlie's radar in a way that I found surprising. Regardless, Keyes' ending was not well received by the publishing industry for broader reasons. He struggled to get both the short story and the novel published because the editors all wanted him to give it a happy ending, failing to realize that the original ending was the whole point. So there's a lot going on here around themes of our treatment of the disabled, the effects of past trauma, and the ethics of uplift as it relates to our fellow humans. Now, you should be aware that it probably wasn't handled with quite the sensitivity it would be today. I don't remember for certain, but I strongly suspect that it contains a lot more ableist language than you'd see today. But I think it was an impressive showing given its place in the history of sci-fi. However, what I find more interesting about this novel is that of the well over 100 books on my classic sci-fi reading list, I believe only 3 of them were assigned reading when I was in high school. 1984, Brave New World, and Flowers for Algernon. A couple others like Frankenstein were on the pick one of 3 lists that we got sometimes. In fact, I won't swear that Flowers for Algernon wasn't, but I think it was the only sci-fi novel besides the classic dystopias that made the cut for everyone to read it. My experience won't be universal, even to my American listeners. Your school might have had different inclusions like Fahrenheit 451, or one of the nuclear war books, or maybe even something by Vonnegut. I think I've seen that somewhere. And none of this is counting children's books. There's a good chance you had A Wrinkle in Time assigned in elementary school, although oddly my teachers didn't do that. I could go off on a whole tangent about why we read the books in English class that we do in the United States. 1984 is probably the most obvious. People regard it as a lesson that is capital I important for citizens of liberal democracies to learn. And I don't disagree with that. Something like Frankenstein is on there because it's a major signpost of the Western literary canon, which is a more fraught concept. And Flowers for Algernon? In those respects, I'm not sure if there's a particular reason why it was included on our reading list. But it does have plenty of English class literary analysis to work with, so make of that what you will. I do remember generally enjoying it when I read it, although that was quite a while ago. The second book I want to cover is, in fact, a trilogy. The Helliconia trilogy by Brian Aldiss. I briefly discussed this one in the Strange New Worlds episode when I was discussing the New Wave. This is a later offering than the New Wave, and it's harder sci-fi in some ways, but it also has hints of the New Wave in how the narrative is centered around societal progress and a rather specific philosophical scientific idea, the Gaia hypothesis. First proposed by James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis in the 1970s, the Gaia hypothesis is essentially the idea that the entire Earth, or at least the entire biosphere, is in some ways a single, self-regulating evolutionary system. Interestingly, the name Gaia hypothesis came from Lord of the Flies author William Golding. This idea has been controversial, for one, because it's in tension with the species-level concept of natural selection, which eschews higher levels of selection. And after all, there's no reason a priori to think biological systems are self-regulating in that way. It's perfectly possible for a biological system to run itself off the rails. Blind, low-level selection plus tragedy of the commons can easily do that. In fact, it's arguably happened once before with the Great Oxygenation Event. But regardless, a second reason the Gaia hypothesis is controversial is because it is very prone to more mystical interpretations that dilute the serious scientific aspects, including, as it happens, from Brian Aldiss. The Helliconia trilogy was published between 1982 and 1985, when the Gaia hypothesis was still fairly young. In the story, Helliconia is a world in a binary star system, containing a sun-like star and an immensely hotter and brighter supergiant. As its sun's orbit brings it closer to and farther from the supergiant, Helliconia's climate swings from Ice Age conditions to tropical heat and back again on a cycle of 2,500 years, forcing the native life forms to adjust radically to adapt to it. Aldiss incorporates the Gaia hypothesis into the trilogy, both with Gaia itself and a Helliconian counterpart called the Original Beholder. Seemingly under the directed influence of the Original Beholder, Helliconia develops humans on its surface, independently evolved, but convergently becoming nearly identical to Earth humans. Also with the Beholder's help, both the humans and the other intelligent species, the Fagors, can communicate with the spirits of the dead on Helliconia, which takes it from kind of mystical all the way to science fantasy. Also, there's a space station in orbit filled with humans from Earth, the only technologically minded humans left after a nuclear war, who embark on a long campaign to study Helliconia from a distance. The local diseases are deadly to Earth humans. Aldiss follows them as well as their society slowly decays into madness and perversion. So, not the most optimistic of stories. I should say, of the 4 books in this episode, Helliconia Spring, the first one of the trilogy, is the only one I could not get through. I just didn't like the format. An anthology story looking at unrelated people over many generations, it doesn't usually work for me. It did work for Dragon's Egg, but in that one, there was the story of the subjectively immortal human explorers to tie it together. Helliconia's conceit is that the planet is the main character, but doing that stretched the different parts of the story out too far for me to really get invested in it. And that was before I learned how weird it gets. As I've read more about the series, I've stood by my decision to pass on it. But hey, maybe you'll feel differently. Also, one more aside. It's not clear where Aldiss got the name Helliconia from. However, Wikipedia speculates that it may be derived from the Heliconian springs in Greece, spelled with 1 L instead of 2, which were said to be sacred to the Muses, and thus a nod to the spirit of literature in some sense. Next up, we have The Road by Cormac McCarthy, the famous post-apocalyptic novel published in 2006 and made into a movie starring Viggo Mortensen in 2009. I briefly mentioned this one in the nuclear war episode, but it didn't quite fit there because the apocalypse is not explicitly described as a nuclear war in the book. In fact, the nature of the apocalypse is never really described at all, except that the country is still covered with ash years later. It's just something that the main characters, the nameless boy and his father, are trying to survive in. It seems to have happened fairly fast enough to be described as occurring during the boy's mother's pregnancy. But neither war nor something like an asteroid or a supervolcano is ever mentioned, nor do the survivors seem to be worried about radiation. The man is suffering from a chronic illness that is implied to be related to the environment somehow, possibly from the ash, but that doesn't seem to be affecting the boy. But the origin of the disaster no longer matters to the man and the boy. All they know is wandering along the road trying to find some place safe they can stay for the winter, largely surviving off of as yet untouched caches of food from preppers who, for whatever reason, didn't make it. They try to avoid other survivors who are often dangerous and several times are found to be eating each other. The Road is a good story, but as a super gritty portrayal of the apocalypse, it wasn't exactly my style. I said something similar about Greenland in the last catch-up episode. I'll go for the spectacle of a big disaster movie like 2012, or even the hopeful amidst disaster tone of something like Lucifer's Hammer, but the more serious takes lean too far to the depressing for my taste. Finally, there's one more book on my list, and this one's a doozy. I'm talking about L. Ron Hubbard's magnificently over-the-top epic, Battlefield Earth. In retrospect, I'm not entirely sure how this one ended up on my reading list. It must have been on at least one of the lists of classic sci-fi books I looked up, but Worlds Without End's aggregator only gives it 2 citations, which is pretty low. Maybe I just thought it was funny and then forgot it was supposed to be more of a wildcard idea. So no, Battlefield Earth really isn't a classic of sci-fi by most people's standards. It's schlocky space opera, which is best known for being schlocky space opera, and being crazy long, and having serious Scientology undertones, being written by the founder of Scientology. And it's famous for its movie adaptation, Scientologist John Travolta's pet project from 2000, actually intended as a part 1 of 2, which many have pilloried as the worst movie of all time. The thing is, I had fun with Battlefield Earth. The book, not the movie. As schlocky space opera goes, I've read a lot worse. Back at the beginning of this podcast, I said I thought the Lensman series, one of the earliest examples, was unreadable drivel. But Battlefield Earth was decently engaging. Now, I think I would chalk a lot of that up to the audiobook adaptation. I found the audiobook to be surprisingly entertaining because they didn't just have someone read it. They recorded the whole thing as a full-cast radio drama with at least some big-name voice actors, including Robin from Teen Titans as Johnny. And it has that old-timey feel about it. I could imagine it airing alongside OG Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon, even though it was written in the 80s. And again, while being much better than Lensman. I will warn you, it is a very long book. In fact, Battlefield Earth is the longest audiobook in my library, at 47.5 hours. It's not the longest one on my overall reading list. That's Atlas Shrugged, which I did read back in my designated edgy college student phase. The faster of the 2 audio versions for that one is 52.5 hours. In fact, going by word count, I think Atlas Shrugged is the longest single volume I've ever encountered in the wild. But I digress. For the record, Battlefield Earth is noticeably ideological, but not nearly that ideological. Also, I should note that it's not to be confused with Mission Earth, an unrelated 10-volume series of Hubbards that taken together is about 3 times as long. That confused me when I first made my list. Now, I keep saying this book is schlocky space opera, so you may ask, why didn't I include it in the previous space opera episode? Well, that was a mistake on my part. Almost the entire story takes place on Earth, and I had parsed it as an alien invasion, post-apocalyptic action kind of story. So I slated it for this episode, and I didn't make the connection that it was really space opera until I was writing the script. The actual story of Battlefield Earth is set on Earth, circa 3000 AD. 1,000 years earlier, Earth was conquered by evil aliens called Cyclos, who wiped out most of the humans. The Cyclos rule most of the universe and various parallel universes. They don't want power over conquered peoples, though. They regard humans as animals and beneath their notice. Instead, they're constantly mining for gold. That's actually less crazy than it sounds, by the way. I examined the question for one of my own projects, and if a galactic civilization wants to have a stable, hard currency, gold and silver may well be the best choice, even with future technology, so long as they don't have matter transmutation. Not that Hubbard was likely to be thinking about that. Anyway, one of the surviving humans, Johnny Goodboy Tyler, they seem to have nicknames as actual middle names for some reason, is captured by a cyclo named Turl and press-ganged into an off-the-books mining operation. But he outsmarts Turl by recruiting a bunch of Scotsmen who hatch a scheme to get rid of the Cyclos for good, only to attract a little too much attention from the rest of the universes in doing so. Now, Hubbard plays pretty fast and loose with the science in his story, hence the space opera label I gave it. The Cyclos universe supports a different periodic table from ours, and their atmosphere is violently incompatible with any kind of radioactivity. And yet, matter from their universe is still stable in ours, and doesn't react to potassium-40 or carbon-14 in the biosphere. Their planet-killing poison gas drone is so tough that it can withstand a point-blank nuclear explosion with nothing but a scorch mark, obviously not using any of their atmosphere in the design. And yet, for some reason, they don't make everything out of that stuff, even though their reactionless drives mean they don't have to worry about weight. There's a lot of silly stuff like that. And yes, it is somewhat ideological. In my limited Wikipedia-level reading about Scientology, you can definitely see hints of that, let's say, institution in the book. From the way Turl is always talking about leverage, to how the reactionless drives work by manipulating space. And of course how the bad guys are called Cyclos, which is a transparent reference to Scientology's disdain for psychology. It's kind of all over the place, I admit. Overall, this book probably isn't going to be a priority on your reading list, but I think you still may want to consider it. This has been a perhaps kind of weird episode of A Reader's History of Science Fiction. This podcast is hosted by Libsyn, and you should be able to listen and subscribe wherever you are now, although the next episode is the last episode, so I guess you really just need to look out for that. I need a book recommendation for this episode, but this is a tough one. None of these books really stood out to me. Maybe that's another reason they never made it into earlier episodes. I couldn't get through Helliconia Spring to begin with, so that one's out. I kind of want to recommend Battlefield Earth, at least as a radio drama, but I recognize it's not for everyone. The Road is good, but I've had enough of the post-apocalyptic stuff. So I guess by process of elimination, my recommendation will have to be Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes. And hey, it was good enough for English class. On second thought, that may or may not be a ringing endorsement, but I'm still going with it. It's a decent story, worth checking out. Anyway, as I said before, the next episode will be the series finale of A Reader's History of Science Fiction. Again, I may do special editions here and there later on, but there will not be a formal Season 3 unless I get an improbable number of new interview requests. To wrap up the series, I interviewed sci-fi historian Lisa Yazek, whose research has focused both on recovering lost voices of sci-fi from the past and on discovering new voices around the globe, which I thought was fitting to talk about the future of science fiction and what we can expect to see in the genre in years to come. And as a special treat, that episode will air in 1 week on May 15th. The interview was a lot of fun, so be sure to tune in for that. Thanks for listening.